classic book, Libertarianism, a primer. This work by David continues to be the best available guide to the history, ideas, and growth of the libertarian movement. Before I introduce David, though, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. So we are in the middle of our 2015 Winter Town Hall program. So tomorrow night, we have Judith Rodin of the Rockefeller Foundation. March 16th, James McPherson, Why the Civil War Still Matters. March 26th, a film screening of Created Equal, Freedom Riders, Roadblocks, and Redemption on Freedom's Main Line. And if you haven't already picked up your copy of our 2015 Winter Town Hall brochure, please grab one on your way out. Finally, Creating Camelot, which is downstairs, is open with great reviews, and we're in the middle of our winter sale, which is continuing through March 31st. For more information on any of these programs, please visit constitutioncenter.org. We will be taking a few audience questions this evening. Please jot down your questions on note cards provided on your seat and hand your card to staff members in the aisles. If you are on Twitter, I invite you to follow us at Constitution Center and use the hashtag NCC Town Hall. Sorry. And lastly, please take a moment now to silence your cell phones. So finally, it is my privilege again to introduce David Boaz, the longtime executive vice president of the Cato Institute and a dear friend of mine. Just to tell you, Cato, he has helped make Cato into one of Washington's premier think tanks and is a leading advocate of market liberal policies, libertarian ideas, and the principles that have shaped the modern liberal world. In addition, he is the author of several books, including The Politics of Freedom, and is the editor of Libertarian Reader. David is the leading authority on domestic issues such as education choice, drug legalization, the growth of government, and the rise of libertarianism. His articles have been published in major newspapers across the country, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, National Review, Slate. And finally, I just want to say that I worked with David for years at the Cato Institute before I came to the Constitution Center. And I just have to thank him for all the great things that I learned working with David. And just so you know, he's a wonderful teacher. His door is always open, particularly for young people who are interested in learning about ideas and public policy. And so he's also, I just want to thank him for always, making me want to do the best that I've ever done. So thank you, David, for doing that. He's hiding there back behind the stage. And so next is Nick Gillespie, who is the editor-in-chief of Reason.com and Reason TV. And I also want to say that Nick is also another good friend of mine, and he's also a leader of the libertarian movement in the U.S. and a keen cultural observer with a special sense for popular culture. And in addition, I can say that he's the co-author with his Reason colleague Matt Welsh of the Declaration of Independence, How Libertarian Politics Can Fix What's Wrong with America. He's also involved with the Daily Beast, has named Gillespie one of the right's top 25 journalists. His work has appeared in many major newspapers, and he is a frequent commentator on radio and television. And I am very honored tonight again to welcome both David Boaz and Nick Gillespie to the stage. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie. This is David Boaz, and we're going to talk for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But David, and I guess to follow up on Leslie's wonderful introduction, I know I've learned a ton from David and continue to on with his continual output at Cato and at other websites and sources around the country. So David, let me start off by asking, in the new book you talk, it's titled The Libertarian Mind. What do you mean by focusing, or what is the purpose of focusing on the libertarian mind, as opposed to the last one was a primer? Maybe we don't need to. The top coat has been done, but what's different about the libertarian mind?
Well, I think a lot of people hear that and they think something psychological, like the work Jonathan Haidt has done on how liberals, conservatives, and libertarians think, the emotions and basic values that appeal to them. I wasn't really thinking that. It's a guide to libertarian thinking. So the way libertarians think, but not the way they think.
Right.
What we think about liberty, equality, dignity, freedom,
Explain
government.
a little bit about that. So, I mean, I suspect that everybody here is, understands libertarianism generally, but how are you defining libertarian in the book?
Well, I define libertarian as the current manifestation of what was once called liberalism or classical liberalism. It wasn't called classical at the time, now we call it classical. Liberal ideas are about freedom, individualism, individual rights, limited government to protect those things, free markets, freedom of religion, and so on. And in some sense, therefore, when you put them in big terms like that, they're the ideas of the American Revolution, the ideas of Western civilization. Your colleague at Reason, Brian Doherty, wrote a wonderful history of the libertarian movement. One of the things he said in there was, libertarian ideas are radical, but the modern Western world runs on approximately libertarian principles. So in that sense, they are fundamental to our world, but we insist that governments in the West and the rest of the world actually live up to these principles.
You mentioned Jonathan Haidt. He's, for those of you who don't know, he's a social psychologist who works at NYU now. He'd been at University of Virginia. And David has been following his work closely, and a lot of people in the libertarian movement have. Some of his recent work says that conservatives, and this is not meant in a kind of smackdown moralistic way, although probably it is, but conservatives and sometimes conservatives themselves will actually puff up their chest and say, you know what, conservative is not a thoughtful philosophy of governance. It is about just saying, no, we should take things slowly and we don't need to have a unified field theory of human nature or of governance. We just want to keep things the way they are and move slowly in a different direction. And Haidt found that, at least in his, when you look at conservatives, they tend to think less critically than liberals, and that libertarians think even more critically than liberals do. And of course, the libertarian movement in America is highly associated with somebody like Ayn Rand, who focused on rationality and reason as the thing that makes us different than beasts. Do libertarians put a premium on rational discourse, and if so, are they just kidding themselves?
I do think libertarians put a premium on rational discourse, but it's possible that that's because it's not easy to become a libertarian. Mm-hmm. The intellectual world, the newspapers, the academy, Hollywood, pretty much modern liberal, not classical liberal, modern liberal. And then there's a conservative counter-establishment, the Reaganites and Fox News and the Wall Street Journal editorial page. So it's reasonably easy, if you're a conservative, to find validators for your ideas. To become
and if say there's 4 people on a panel, at Fox or even at Meet the Press, one is reserved for the token conservative.
Yes.
But the libertarian is not quite.
Well, that's generally right.
Yeah.
So that's right. If you're going to get to libertarian ideas, it's generally not by seeing people in the media and say, oh yeah, that's what I think.
Or let's face it, seeing successful people anywhere in America.
No, actually there are plenty of successful people who are libertarians, though they aren't necessarily identified that way. But it does mean that to become a libertarian, you're more likely to have arrived at those ideas by reading books, or at least talking to people who read books, or something like that. Now, we've done surveys at Cato, David Kirby and I, in which we find that anywhere from 15, 20, up to 40% of Americans hold broadly libertarian views, meaning sort of socially tolerant and fiscally conservative. But most of those people don't know they're libertarians. They're not libertarians in the sense of the ideas outlined in this book, but they're not really liberals or conservatives either. They don't really belong at either Fox News or NPR. So one of my goals with this book is to reach those 40 million people and say, if you think the government spends too much and it should stay out of your personal life, you just might be a libertarian.
Yeah, and we should talk about the ascendancy of libertarian ideas and approaches to policy and kind of living. I mean, we're in a moment that sometimes some of us had reason at Cato throughout the libertarian movement. We talk about the libertarian moment, or there's a groundswell of something of attention to it. And when you think of issues like school choice, drug policy, privatization of government services, criminal justice reform, marriage equality, freer trade, if not quite free trade, a general recognition that markets are pretty good at not only kind of spreading resources around and opportunities, but actually creating new, innovative, dynamic ways to do things. There is a libertarian ascendancy here. What do you think is driving that? Is it an ideological awakening on the part of Americans, or is it just an exhaustion with failures from a conservative and a liberal point of view?
Well, I think ideological awakening by the whole country is probably too strong. I think what's happening is that freedom works, and eventually people figure that out. Political scientists have noted that as countries get richer, if they start to economically develop, there comes to be a point, and they try to find a place, it's $2,000 a year or $6,000 a year, that they start demanding political freedom as well, and that they start expecting personal freedom. Once you start making decisions in the marketplace, you expect to make other decisions. So that's part of it. And around the world, I think absolutely people are finally discovering they tried planning in half the world and it was a disaster. And it turns out countries that are engaged in the global economy, that allow people to experiment, start companies and so on, those companies get richer. And there is a growing tendency to respect freedom of religion, freedom of personal choices, the rule of law. I think people are noticing that countries with the rule of law are more successful. And this process has been going on a long time. It was the Netherlands originally. They had freedom of religion and markets. And people started noticing, oh, that seems like a very pleasant place to live. It's getting richer than the entire world at that time. Englishmen noticed that. Then people noticed that it was also working in England, and it spread out from there. And so it's taken, 300 years to get to Asia and Africa, but it is starting to get there. And even in Africa, you're starting to see some countries adopt greater levels of rule of law and markets and starting to get richer. And of course, in Asia, China and India have moved a long way in those directions, and that's what accounts for, I can absolutely say, the world is freer than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but you can kind of win that argument just on the basis of China and India.
I guess it was Milton Friedman, and not alone, but he popularized the idea that you get economic freedom first and then political freedom starts to grow. Do you think, is it always that way, or is it necessarily, in a weird way, and you can see it in places like Chile, which was an autocracy or a dictatorship, and then because they had tried everything else, finally they made some market reforms, people got wealthier, and then people started clamoring for political rights and for kind of certain types of personal freedom. Same thing happened in China. Is that a stock answer, that economy first, politics second?
That seems to be what we observe. If you go back to the Netherlands and England as places these ideas first began to be implemented, I think you could say markets were arising in Northern Europe and also in Italy. And then they developed into demands for political freedom. If we look at it today, we do see this pattern in places like Taiwan and Korea, and maybe now in China. India is an interesting example. India was a democracy for about a generation before they came very close to a functioning economy. Even there, you would have to say, India was not a socialist country. It was a mixed economy with a socialist ideology, but it was not fully socialist. The countries that were fully socialist did not develop in this direction. Eventually, socialism failed.
Right.
and there was a revolution, a peaceful revolution, but there was a revolutionary change in those countries.
You know, it's interesting when you think about communism and the Cold War and whatnot, how many communist countries, I mean, it's kind of stunning, isn't it, how many of them collapsed and had essentially peaceful transitions to a post-communist regime.
Yes, that's right, although you have to remember it was kind of one country. I mean, Russia was the dominant quasi-occupying power in all of those Central Asian and Central European countries. And a lot of what happened there was when Gorbachev sent a signal that the Russian army will not intervene to protect socialism in other countries because every country must find its own path. Suddenly people realized, oh, if the Russian army isn't coming, then we can start protesting, we can start driving across the border into the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia then, where things are a little better. We can go through the fence between Hungary and Austria. And they kind of kept looking around, and the Russian army didn't come. And I think by that point, the ruling classes in many of those countries had lost their internal belief in what they were doing, and the rest of the country had lost it entirely. So they went down very fast, much faster than people expected.
Yeah. We both had attended the Students for Liberty conference. Students for Liberty is a group that's, what, about 8 or 10 years old?
7.
Okay, and in D.C., where they said they had 1,500 students turning out. Kind of amazing turnout, a lot of energy in the room. Talk a little bit about, you know, a lot of people, certainly those of us in the libertarian movement, talk a lot about how millennials are kind of natural libertarians. They were raised in the internet age, and the internet has some kind of logic or grammar in it that seems inherently libertarian. It's decentralized. It allows for a lot of permissionless innovation. People can roam around, and you create your own kind of structures and models for how to govern things. You know, a bulletin board will have these rules or these terms of use, et cetera. Somebody else will have something else. Do you think there is a spike in interest in libertarian ideas and ways of seeing the world among younger people? And what are the issues that seem to resonate most from a libertarian perspective with millennials?
Well, there's probably two things going on there. Yes, absolutely, there's an increase in interest in libertarian ideas. Journalists often ask me, is there a surge of libertarian thinking these days? And one of the things I tell them is, 7 years ago, there was no National Libertarian Student Organization. Now there are 2. Now, if they were 2 tiny groups of 4 people on the internet or something, that wouldn't mean very much. But in fact, both Students for Liberty and Young Americans for Liberty are very vibrant organizations. I was in a conservative student youth group many years ago, and I know what we actually had, and I know what they have, and they're pretty strong. Students for Liberty may indeed have gotten 1,500 students to Washington on this bitterly cold weekend we just concluded. Young Americans for Liberty has a mailing list, an email list of over 100,000. Together they have something like 1,500 chapters at college campuses. Students for Liberty has now developed groups in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They had a conference with over 1,000 students in Africa on libertarian ideas. So a whole lot of people who are interested in libertarian ideas. Now the more difficult question is, how much libertarian thinking generally is there among young people? And there I think you can say, on issues like marijuana and marriage and transgender and other sexual issues, overwhelmingly libertarian. I talked to one of your young reporters just this weekend who was telling me about libertarianism on campus, and he said, well, look, you have to realize there is no right on the American campus today. There just are no conservatives. So there's a tiny number of leftists. There's a large mass of people who generally accept a lot of the liberal government should take care of people ideas, and there's a growing libertarian sentiment. But millennials are growing up in a world of infinite lifestyle choices, technological choices, market choices that has to be shaping the way they see the world. And I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. I think if you poll them, you still get, oh yeah, government should take care of people's health care. And yet, they can see that these programs don't work very well. And in the long run, that has to affect the way they're thinking.
It seems that, and this is true of an earlier youth movement, the anti-war movement as well, that foreign policy is a major, major issue. And certainly younger people, millennials, have grown up against the backdrop, first of terrorism, the 9/11 attacks in 2001, and then an uninterrupted, adolescent and young adulthood of failed foreign policies. Nobody is, even the Bush and Obama loyalists can't pretend that, things have gone the way that they thought they would or that they should. How does foreign policy fit into, I think you're right, when you go into a Starbucks and you can get any coffee drink you want, even one without coffee, and milk drinks without milk, and all of this, it makes you wonder, like, okay, what else is possible? And then on the flip side, we had these kind of instances of so-called nation building or region building that just went terribly wrong. How does foreign policy fill out that equation of libertarianness?
Well, that's an interesting question. My sense is that current interventions are very unpopular with young people. We have to be careful to distinguish between college students and young people, right, because kids who don't go to college think differently sometimes from people who do go to college. We've never had a generation of young people who are, let's say, 20 to 25 today. They have never known a time that the United States was not at war. Now, I grew up during the Cold War, and it absolutely was the framework in which I saw the world. The world is divided, half slave, half free. It's always been that way. It'll always be that way. And when we read 1984 and we read, we have always been at war with East Asia, we thought it applied to the Cold War. But for anybody who's 20 or 25 today, it applies to the world they live in. They have not known a time the United States was not at war. How does that shape them? Will it make them anti-war? Will it make them take war as a matter of course? Maybe even something where we are at war, but not that many Americans are fighting and not that many Americans are dying. Will they just take it as a matter of course? That's one of the things that happens, is that the United States is always at war somewhere, probably in the Middle East. I would think there ought to be a stronger anti-war movement now than there is.
Right.
And it may be, when I was in college at the end of the Vietnam War, we still worried about being drafted and sent to Vietnam. That's a pretty powerful incentive for an anti-war movement. Without that, we're not getting that much of that.
And it's also an interesting moment of a kind of libertarian triumph. Milton Friedman, who was involved in the committee, the Gates Commission, that ended the draft, and Richard Nixon, bless his heart, was working to get an all-volunteer army to get rid of the draft. And there's a great moment where Milton Friedman shut down William Westmoreland by saying, Westmoreland said he didn't want to have an army of mercenaries, and Friedman responded, "You would rather have an army of slaves," meaning draftees. So we may be a victim of our own success.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think you can certainly make a case. If you had a draft, there would be more hostility to going to war.
Right.
I don't want to have a draft.
No. Yeah. Well, one of the other things, and I think you're right to talk about the distinction between college students and young people generally, because a lot of people are either out of college or don't go to college. But it's also true that college students today seem to be in, for those of us, I'm a little bit younger than David, and I grew up in a great moment where at college, there were essentially no required courses. There was no in loco parentis. That was, but then it came back even by the time I graduated from undergrad in '85, and by that point, the drinking age had effectively been raised, and the return of in loco parentis was starting, and now it seems berserk with speech codes and all sorts of behavioral codes and just kind of, shaming of anybody for all sorts of reasons. Do you think that's having an impact on the way young people perceive, both the possibilities and the limits of getting through life?
I think I'm too old to know what young people think. There seems to be a lot of hostility to these college speech codes and extrajudicial sexual inquisitions and things. But my sense is most of the opposition comes from older writers and the ACLU, not from college students themselves. Now, it may partly be it's actually dangerous to challenge these things if you're a college student, and so maybe people are afraid of that. but I'm not sure just how unpopular they are.
And this might be a leap of logic. I highly recommend this book. I reviewed the earlier version of it for Reason back in the 90s, and it taught me a huge amount of things that I continue to carry with me. And this is not simply a kind of cosmetic update. It's a real fundamental revision, and I think reconceptualization, taking into account all of the things that have changed. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and this might be a leap from a kind of campus inquisition to struggles for religious freedom in 17th century England, which is really one of the places you locate the origins of the modern libertarian movement, that it comes out of an attempt, struggles for freedom of conscience to worship God as you see fit in 17th century England, where they were disestablishing the church, and a bunch of religious radicals were saying, we want to be left alone to worship God as we see fit. Talk about that. And I mean, it seems somewhat ironic since many libertarians, contemporary libertarians, are atheists. And it's kind of interesting that we would be the inheritors of a movement that was founded in absolute belief in worshiping God your own way.
Well, atheists certainly need a world of freedom of conscience. And to some extent, it might be that the fathers of established churches were correct to perceive that if you allow people to worship as they please, some might choose to worship Satan or to worship no God at all, and that was precisely what they were afraid of. But yes, I do believe that to a great extent, and not only as far back as 17th century England, but as far back as Becket and even back in the 4th century, and the conflicts between popes and states and kings and the people, that was one of the ways that freedom developed in the West, was by people fighting over how much power any of these institutions would have. In the 17th century in England in particular, there were these arguments about the right way to worship God. And yes, to some extent, the people who created the ideas that became liberalism and libertarianism were people who believed so strongly in the right way to worship God that they were willing to put their lives on the line for it. I'm not sure how many atheists want to put their lives on the line for atheism, but if you believe your immortal soul is at stake when you are forced to worship in the wrong way, then you will fight harder. And there were a lot of English and other religious martyrs, and from their struggles developed this idea of the individual conscience, individual autonomy, the right to think, the right to worship as you please, which naturally then implies the right to think and to speak as you please.
And the limit on the state
Right.
dictating, or the idea that the God or the king is a vessel of God on earth. In that sense, it's also one of the things that I think is a really powerful insight in your work in general, and certainly in this book, is the idea that libertarianism is not a philosophy of life per se. It's not a totalitarian. When you look at kind of Islamism coming out of post-World War II Egypt with Cato and other people, where theorists would say, we want a Islamic economics, we want an Islamic sociology. They wanted to be able to chart every aspect of human existence from the proper Islamic point of view. You stress that libertarianism is a political philosophy, and in that sense it doesn't really dictate every aspect of your life. Talk a little bit about that and why that, for you, is an attractive feature of it.
Well, of course, it isn't just Islamism. There are plenty of kinds of Christianity that prescribe the way you should live your life, whether it's in terms of sex or the food and drink that you put in your body, or dancing. I grew up in a town where lots of people didn't dance because God didn't approve of dancing.
So do you go to card shows or magic shows, or those?
Not some people, that's right. So there are lots of philosophies that prescribe how to live your life. Libertarianism doesn't do that. Libertarian just says the government shouldn't tell you how to live your life. You make your own choices. Any individual libertarian might be a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, an objectivist, and have pretty strong views about how you ought to live. But that's not libertarianism. In some sense, I think libertarianism should be everybody's second choice. Your first choice might be a world where the Pope is also the king, and he makes the rules for everybody. Your first choice might be a world where Richard Dawkins is the king and he gets to ban religion. But for each of these groups, the second choice should be nobody gets to tell other people what they can think, how they can live, what kind of business they have to practice. So in that sense, libertarianism is second best for everybody, and it is not a philosophy of life, it is a philosophy of the relationship between the individual and the state. Communitarian philosophers criticize libertarianism, or they might just say liberalism, and say the language of rights is morally incomplete. And that's absolutely true. The language of rights is very narrow. The language of rights says, in effect, you cannot hit me or take my stuff. But a moral philosophy absolutely advises you on how to treat your spouse, how to treat your children, how to treat your employees, how to treat your neighbors, how to treat your own body. A morally complete philosophy gets into all of those topics. Libertarianism doesn't.
Libertarianism, in this sense, is not really a partisan designation. And, I think everybody here probably understands there's a Libertarian Party with a capital L. What David is mostly talking about, and what I tend to talk about, is a libertarian with a small l. It's kind of a pre-partisan designation. There is a rising libertarian, we've talked about this, to call it a wing of the GOP, a libertarian wing of the GOP, it would be a very, very tiny, it's more like a single feather possibly on it. But there is a rising interest in libertarian ideas in the Republican Party. What is driving that, and what might hinder it? And then is there something analogous in the Democratic Party too, which would kind of, is the baseline of pre-political thinking growing in a libertarian direction?
Well, it is absolutely true that I never before saw articles about the libertarian faction in the Republican Party and the libertarian wing in Congress and everything, and we're seeing those now, so something is new. Journalists are perceiving that there's a growth here. I believe it's in the Washington Post today. There's an article about presidential candidates, and it talks about how there are four wings of the Republican Party that they have to appeal to: the establishment wing, the Tea Party, the social religious conservatives, and the libertarians. Now, they say the libertarians are the smallest wing, but they have a lot of overlap with the Tea Party wing, to the extent that the Tea Party is focused on economic issues, overspending, and so on. So yeah, there obviously is a change there. I think part of it is a reaction to George W. Bush and the Republican Congress, because Republicans told us for years, just because we have the Senate doesn't mean we can cut the size of government, because the Democrats still have the House and the presidency. Then they said just because we have the Senate and the House we can't cut, because the Democrats still have the presidency. Then the Republicans got all three, and they raised federal spending by $1 trillion during the Bush years. So anybody who thought that was a bad idea should logically be looking to upset that apple cart, overturn the kinds of people who are running the Republican Party, and bring in a different group. Now, some of those Tea Partiers are conservative on foreign policy and social issues. They're not libertarian. Some of them are libertarian on that range of issues, but together they at least want a more critical attitude toward everything the federal government does, and that counts for something. Now, is there that in the Democratic Party? I don't see much. There are Democrats who are more pro-civil liberties than others. There are Democrats who are more anti-war. If you look at something like the Amash Amendment a year and a half ago to rein in a tiny part of what the NSA was doing, the interesting thing about that was, who is Justin Amash? I think at the time he was a freshman congressman, and he has the audacity to propose an amendment to limit what the NSA is doing. And the leadership of the House was stunned when they realized he was going to get 200 votes for that, but only about 200. Didn't quite get a majority. But the interesting thing was he got about half of each party. More Republicans, well, I'm not sure about that. He got about half of each party. So there is a civil libertarian wing of the Democrats. There is an economic libertarian wing of the Republicans, which is also becoming more critical of things like the NSA. But in terms of economics, it's hard to find Democrats who are very critical of the welfare state and overregulation. And I look at Obama's big government agenda, and it's kind of stunning to me that apparently the only faction in the Democratic Party that's dissatisfied with that is the ones who want a bigger government agenda, and therefore they want Elizabeth Warren. I don't, for instance, see them saying, let's all get behind Russ Feingold, the one senator who voted against the Patriot Act. What they're saying is, let's get behind Elizabeth Warren because we know that she really hates capitalism. Now, as it turns out, when push comes to shove, she won't even support auditing the Federal Reserve and its relationship with the big banks. But
Or letting the authorization of the Export-Import Bank, which gives money and loans to foreign countries to buy American goods. It's
so pure
crony
corporate welfare
capitalism,
for big companies, Elizabeth Warren is for. But still, she has this image of a populist battler for the little guy for bigger government.
Well, do you think, and this is obviously a loaded question, but on the Warren side, I mean, kind of pure progressive politics, and Obama incarnated a lot of that in his first 2 years in office, both with Obamacare, but also the stimulus and a variety of other things, as well as an increase in defense spending. That's been fairly well discredited, at least in recent memory. It led to a Republican takeover of Congress. And then on the Republican side, as you were talking about, I mean, the Bush administration, or the 6 years where the Republicans held every part of the federal government and just blew the doors off of budget, is that leading to, maybe it's not an embrace of libertarian ideas, but it clearly exhausted any idealism or delusions that people would have that conservatives or liberals were actually serious about doing anything?
Well, I think so. And if you just ask people, do you think we should have another party? Large percentages say, yeah, there should be another party. If you ask people, are you a Democrat, Republican, or independent? The rising number has been independents. So there's a lot of disillusionment with the two parties. It hasn't yet settled on what it is that we want as an alternative to what we're getting from the two parties.
Talk a little bit, you mentioned growing up in what I take to be a dry town in the Bible Belt. Talk a little bit about your ideological journey over the years. You also mentioned being in a conservative student group when you were younger. I know you're from Kentucky. That is a state west of the Appalachians, for those of you who haven't been across the Schuylkill in a while. But talk a little bit about where you came from and how you've evolved, but also, is there a continuity there?
Yeah, there's a continuity. I did grow up in western Kentucky, which was very strongly Democratic territory, but it also had been Confederate back during the Civil War, and so it was conservative Democrats, but still Democrats. And I grew up, my parents were sort of constitutional conservatives, but Democrats. And I grew up thinking of myself as a conservative, and then I read economics in one lesson and really came to understand economics. I read Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative when I was in high school, which is really a very libertarian book, except for the final chapter that proposes nuking the Soviet Union. But other than that, it's pretty
And that's because he wanted to use government bombs, not privately provisioned nuclear
But other than that, it's a pretty libertarian book. And then I read Ayn Rand, and then I read some conservative articles debating freedom versus order, and that made me realize I'm on the freedom side of that. And I drifted pretty firmly in the libertarian direction, though I was, once I got away from home and could admit to not being a Democrat, I was a Republican for a while, but we all do things in our youth. Now I'm an independent and a small L libertarian. I wrote an article a few years ago saying that based on various statistical measures, Kentucky appeared to be the least libertarian state in the Union. Since then, they've elected Rand Paul and Thomas Massie to Congress, so I would like to get the political scientist who did the heavy lifting on this to go back and look at those numbers again.
Well, and I know from previous conversations you talk in that, and anybody who is Scotch-Irish will understand this. You're both proud of a Scotch-Irish heritage, as well as it's always a chip on anyone's shoulder, right?
Oh, it really is a chip on anybody's shoulder.
And it's also true that lineage goes through a kind of classical liberal period that you're talking about. I mean, how is that important to who you are and what you?
Oh, I don't know. I only discovered I was Scotch-Irish, or possibly not, it turns out, a little bit later in life. My ethnicity is small-town rural Protestant. The Scotch-Irish do have a reputation for honor and being jealous of their rights. And you know, when I read this terrible story out of North Carolina about the guy who shot 3 Muslim neighbors, but people said it's over a parking dispute, my first thought was, a Scotch-Irish guy who takes offense at somebody who parks in his space and goes nuts, who is born fighting, as Jim Webb's book said. However, I went and looked it up, and the first line I saw about the genealogy of the name of the shooter was an old Anglo-Saxon name. But of course, the Anglo-Saxons who were north, who were fighting with the Scots, they had the same hair trigger taking offense.
All right, so when we come to your questions, if he gets mad, it's your fault. Do you, what, I guess, before we turn to audience questions, what would you like the book to accomplish?
Well, I would like it to accomplish 100,000 sales, so I hope everybody will buy one and buy one for a friend. I hope it situates what I think is reasonable radical libertarianism in 2015. So it's got chapters on individualism, individual rights, pluralism, toleration, the market process, as well as a briefer discussion of contemporary American politics and policy issues. So I want it to be a readable, accessible, but comprehensive introduction, overview of what libertarianism is at this point in time, drawing on the founders and Mises and Hayek and Rand and Epstein and Nozick, but putting it all together in an accessible way. And also, one of the things I want it to do is to be found by these tens of millions of disillusioned Americans who think we tried the social extremism and the neocon wars of the Republicans. That didn't work out very well. We tried the big government agenda of Obama, and that didn't work out very well. What is it that would work? And I hope people will discover both this set of ideas and the word libertarian. Because one of the things that hurts libertarians in the political process is most libertarians don't know they're libertarians. So you got a lot of liberal Democrats, and they think of themselves as liberal Democrats. You've got a lot of conservative Republicans, and they tune in Fox, and they hear conservative, conservative, conservative over and over, and they know who they are. I want libertarians to have that same kind of identity and to recognize that they are a larger faction in American politics than they think they are.
So, well, thank you for that. Okay, here's a first question from the audience. Why do most libertarian leaders, such as Rand Paul and Paul Ryan, oppose gay marriage and a woman's right to choose?
Well, I wouldn't call Paul Ryan a libertarian, so I don't have to be responsible for him. He's a reasonably good free marketer. I do think Ron Paul and Rand Paul both have a range of views about politics that can reasonably be called libertarian. If you look at Rand Paul, he's talking about smaller government, lower taxes, balancing the budget at a lower level. He's talking about overregulation. He's talking about reining in the NSA, taking a more cautious and skeptical approach to foreign intervention. You put all those things together, that's about as libertarian a package as we've seen in an American politician. And he's also pro-life and opposes gay marriage. One answer to that is libertarian politicians are still politicians, and he is elected in Kentucky, and he had at least as tough a race in the Republican primary as he did in the general election, and it's pretty tough to tell somebody to run in a Kentucky Republican primary as a supporter of gay marriage or abortion.
You don't doubt, I mean, he's also, he was, I believe, raised a Baptist, went to a Baptist college. I don't know if there are Baptist eye doctor schools or not, but, you know, I mean, you
Duke.
You don't doubt that he actually is, in his heart of hearts, I mean, this is
in his heart of hearts, I have no doubt that he genuinely believes abortion is the taking of life, and he is pro-life. On the marriage issue, I suspect that like a lot of Americans, back when he was a Texas teenager college student, it never occurred to him, and that President Obama was about 50 when it finally dawned on him to support gay marriage.
Right, and he was under 50 in the polls, right? Which is when he realized, oh.
And I would guess that a lot of Americans, including Republicans, are going to evolve on that.
Here's another question. Do you believe that there should be no government programs for any of the people? And I guess this means kind of entitlement or transfer payments.
I think that most of these programs hurt the people they're intended to help. Welfare programs are trapping people into multi-generational dependency, and I don't think that is a good idea for those people. It's not good for taxpayers because it costs money, but the money that we spend on that we can afford. It's expensive, but we can afford it. What it's really doing, I think, is ruining lives. And what you want is programs of charity that will help people get back on their feet, get their lives in order, get jobs. And it seems to me private charity has a much more successful record in that regard. So if you look at what would you want to do to help people who are poor, the first answer, I think, is they should turn to their family and families should help. Second answer is they should help themselves. And there are self-help associations where people mutually get together in order to rely on each other. Maybe the third answer is you want a growing economy, and all these taxes and regulations are not helping a growing economy. Then you have churches and synagogues. Then you have charities. And only if all of those fail should you turn to government. But we turned to government in advance and sapped the life out of the churches and the charities and even families. You know, I have a friend who said to me once when I was complaining about the cost of Social Security, if it costs our society $200 billion a year to keep my mother from living with me, it's worth every penny. I understand that attitude, yeah. But that's one of the ways government breaks up families and replaces families. So I was talking there about the poor. When you talk about the more expensive programs, Social Security and Medicare, there I would just say it is actually not all that efficient to tax everyone in America, send the money to Washington, take a cut, and then pay it out to them years later with them having earned no compound interest, no wealth from it. We'd all be better off if we had been saving that money for 40 years and we retired with $1 million rather than with a Social Security check.
What about K through 12 education? And you know, this is something Cato, Reason, most libertarians, I think, our first choice would be to separate the state from education, but by the same token, we spend a lot of time talking about how school choice programs in Philadelphia is a city that has been experimenting a lot in this. You know, is that an okay use of government funds?
Well, I would say what I want as a libertarian policy person is to move in the direction of more freedom, which I believe would result in more social harmony and more social progress and more economic progress. So I think that a tax credit or scholarship program is better than a complete state monopoly in education. But it's true, ideally, I think that people who have children should be responsible for the raising of those children, and educating your children is part of that. The other thing you have to look at is schools look the same as they did when I was a kid, and they look the same as they did when my mother was a kid and when my grandmother was a kid. They've put computers in the back, but they don't really change. So imagine every other form of information technology in our society, audio, video, the internet. Everything has been revolutionized, not just in my mother's lifetime, in my lifetime, in my children's lifetimes. And what forms of communication have not been changed? The Postal Service and the schools. And why is that? Because they're government monopolies. So it's not just that sort of I want to privatize the schools. I want to bring the benefits of progress and innovation to the process of education. The idea that it should take 12 years to learn the skills, that after 4 more years, I just read an article today saying, after 16 years of education, college graduates don't have job skills.
Right. I was going to say, too, that schools also look a lot like prisons, which have changed more than I think most elementary schools. Here's a question. Please comment on libertarian foreign policy, which you did somewhat, but especially as it relates to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So maybe a way of focusing that a little bit more is, you know, what should the American military be doing about terrorism, both here and abroad? Is it the same thing or is it different?
Well, we should be investigating, we should have intelligence, we should go after people who attack America. What we should not do is be trying to occupy and nation build and chase terrorists, potential terrorists all over the world, and we shouldn't be spying on all Americans in order to find a tiny number of terrorists, whether domestic or abroad. So when you talk about ISIS, what I would say is, who ever heard of ISIS until recently? ISIS is a product of the U.S. intervention in Iraq that disrupted that society, that tore things apart, and these new groups arose. Now, we can't say that about Al-Qaeda. It comes before the American invasion of Iraq, though it doesn't come before American meddling in the Middle East. I think the purpose of the American military is to defend the lives and property of the American people and not to police the world. That shouldn't be our burden. So even right now, with something as horrible as ISIS going on, what I would say is it's the responsibility of the countries in that part of the world, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, maybe Israel. Those are the countries that should police their neighborhood. There's no reason the United States needs to be policing the entire world.
You know, and to go back to you were mentioning 1984, you know, we're now in the war against ISIS. We're, of course, allies with Syria and Iran, which just a few months ago, really, those were our sworn enemies in the region. So, okay, here's a couple of questions about marijuana legalization. One person says, as a libertarian, the legalization of marijuana is an ideal, but what type of regulation by government would be acceptable to you? And then somebody else writes, does not classical liberalism imply individual responsibility? One must suffer the consequences of their acts. How do you square that with liberalizing drug policies?
Well, again, as I said about education, my policy view is policies that move us closer to a society of freedom and responsibility are better than policies that don't. So my ultimate view is that adults should be able to make the decisions about what to do with their own bodies and their own lives. And if adults want to use marijuana or cocaine, that should be their right. Children are in a different situation, but adults should be able to do that. If we can get medical access to marijuana, that's better than not allowing it. If we can get access to marijuana but not other drugs, legal access, then that's better than not making that change. But responsibility is part of it, absolutely. People have to be responsible for the consequences of their actions. That was a decision we made in 1933 when we decided to legalize alcohol again. Alcohol does more damage to people and society than marijuana does, but we decided that the costs of alcohol prohibition were added on to the problems caused by alcohol. They didn't really diminish the problems of alcohol. So I would say the same thing is true with the currently illegal drugs. There are problems caused by the use of drugs. There are more problems caused by the prohibition of drugs.
What about that question of regulation? What amount of regulation or taxation is, are you good with?
Well, it's not necessarily up to me, but as I said, I'm in favor, in almost every area, I'm in favor of more freedom and less regulation. So about 20 years ago, I wrote an article in the New York Times about legalizing drugs, and it was kind of a debate took place then. The mayor of Baltimore called for legalizing drugs, and we had some real debate, and we testified before.
And he has really never been heard from again, right? I mean, Kurt Schmoke had a good run, but he failed to
Well, he is the
progress.
president of a college, so
Yeah.
it's not like he's in the gutter. But it's true that he did not, he got reelected,
Yeah.
but he never sought higher office. However, I remember testifying before Congress at that time, and Congressman Charlie Rangel of New York thought that he would really put the legalizers over a barrel by handing out a list of like 30 questions. Who would sell it? In what quantities? Who would inspect it? So on, so on, so on. 30 questions. And a state senator from New York responded by submitting the list of 30 questions with the words, just like alcohol, in response to each one. Who would sell it? Wherever alcohol is sold. Who would inspect it? Whoever inspects alcohol. Who would be allowed to buy it? Whoever is allowed to buy alcohol. Now, that's not an entirely libertarian answer, because obviously what we do with alcohol is not entirely libertarian. As Nick said, I grew up in a dry county. It is illegal to sell or purchase alcohol there. So as you know, no one uses alcohol in the town I grew up in. There are all kinds of rules about alcohol, and some of them are less libertarian than others, and in general, I would prefer to push the rules on marijuana for adults to the most liberal, least regulated system. But we would have more peaceful cities and emptier jails if we simply stopped arresting people for buying drugs or using drugs. We would have a better society if we made it a ticket instead of a jail term, and so on.
And you know, Charles Rangel is an interesting case where he's learned from experience, because 20 or so more years ago, he was pushing much higher criminal sentences for crack cocaine than powder cocaine, because the crack epidemic was happening partly in his district, and he more recently has come, he was one of the reasons why the sentencing disparities were finally lessened. So that's interesting to see other people learning from experience. Here's a question for David and Nick. Nick says, we're in a libertarian moment. Should we have a constitutional convention? Would it be more libertarian than the 1787 version?
We're not in that libertarian a moment. No, it would not be more libertarian. I know a lot of my friends are getting into this idea. I do not think it is a good idea to unleash a constitutional convention on our remaining constitutional rights. It was addressed to you, too.
Yeah, no, I have to clear my throat. No, I would be fascinated. I think it would be great to see, but I fear, things can always get worse. So, do you foresee economic freedom in your lifetime? Yes or no? How do you see our debt problems playing out?
Well, I see a lot of economic freedom in my lifetime right now. I seem to be more optimistic than a lot of libertarians. I spend most of my day criticizing the policies of the U.S. government, certainly in the economic area. On the other hand, as I said a minute ago, around the world, there's clearly more economic freedom, and indeed, I have statistical evidence for this. I have a report called the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which you can find on the web, and it shows they've been measuring the economic freedom of every country in the world since, I think, 1975, and I think every year it's gone up, except the last 4 or 5 years it went down a bit, but I think it ticked back up. Anyway, the difference from 40 years ago to now is pretty significant. Now, that's especially true in China and India, and when you population weight these things, that makes a big difference. So in the United States, it's not entirely clear. However, we should not assume that we are on a one-way road to serfdom even in the United States. Think about it. We had New Deal cartel legislation coming out of the 1930s. In the 1970s, we undid a lot of that. It's what gave us the telephone revolution. It's what gave us a financial revolution, transportation revolution. We got airline deregulation. The government used to mandate that airlines fly nice big 727s into my hometown, and that was cool. I liked that. So I am a victim of airline deregulation because I can no longer get a 727 into Paducah, Kentucky. But it's probably economically efficient for the country that they only fly small planes into small towns. We also had, when I was born, I think, 90% income tax rates. When I entered the workforce, 70% marginal income tax rates. And now the highest marginal rate is officially about 40%, although of course there are some add-ons. So we have not been on a one-way ratchet toward serfdom. The national debt and the unsustainable entitlements are the scariest part of the economic system. What are we going to do about that? The national debt was $1 trillion in 1980. Now it's $18 trillion. And during that time, we did not have a depression or a war. It's one thing if you go into that much debt because you have a war that might actually threaten the survival of the nation. But we didn't have a significant depression or war, and yet we ran up $17 trillion in new debt. That's a very difficult problem, and I understand why libertarians wonder if anything can be done about that. However, I do believe we will find our way out of that.
What are your main worries about the debt? Is it that it will end up, the government will just start printing a ton of money and induce inflation to get out of it? Is it that it'll crowd out all other government spending and then blow out the budget? Or what are your fears
all of those are possible, or that we will jack up tax rates in a desperate and failed attempt to raise enough money to pay for it.
And then slow economic growth.
Right,
yeah.
right. And so we have these unsustainable entitlements. We are never going to be able to pay people the 100 trillion or even 200 trillion, depending on how you calculate it, in unfunded liabilities. What will we do about that? We tried with Social Security to say, look, transform from what we have now into a system of privately funded, individually managed accounts, and the miracle of compound interest and investment and economic growth will provide you with a better retirement system, and then that will cover the payments we owe. We couldn't get that through. It is very hard to take things away from people who already have them and expect them, which is why it's so important to fight each new proposed entitlement. So I'm not sure exactly how we're going to get out of that, but health care in particular is going to become increasingly obviously unsustainable because health care is going to get so much better that there will be so much more money that the government could be expected to spend on. And yes, then we will find out that we'll be faced with choices of a dramatic increase in taxes, which will so slow economic growth that it won't get the revenue they expected, printing money, which could cause hyperinflation and therefore hurt the economy, borrowing even more, sucking all the capital out of the economy, or telling people, as some states are doing, we promised you more than we can deliver. We're going to have to renegotiate this.
Okay, we'll do one more question then. And there's a famous book called "It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand," a memoir of Jerome Tachilli running for governor in New York, I think in 1972, on the Libertarian Party ticket. Highly recommended. But we're going to end with Ayn Rand. How does libertarianism differ from the ideas of Ayn Rand?
Well, we talked earlier about complete philosophies, which might be traditional Catholicism, might be Islamism. Objectivism, the ideas of Ayn Rand, are also a complete philosophy. Metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and only then, she says, do you get to politics, the relationship of the individual and the state. So in my view, although Ayn Rand did not like to hear this, and her biggest fans don't like to hear it, in my view, Ayn Rand is a libertarian, and all objectivists are libertarians because they believe in individual rights and limited government, but not all libertarians are objectivists because not all libertarians agree with the objectivist metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So politically, objectivists should be part of the libertarian movement, even though they chafe at the term. And I would say an awful lot of libertarians have read Ayn Rand and got a passionate belief in individual rights from her. Certainly it was valuable to me to read Ayn Rand and get that view, but objectivists and libertarians have a certain tense relationship because the objectivists do believe that it's very important to have this philosophical basis for your ideas.
You know what, I'm going to, like the government, I'm going to exceed my, my capacity here. And I realized as I was thinking, okay, so we're on Independence Mall, we're in the Constitution Center. Who is your favorite and least favorite founding father? In the favorite, we always get asked, and I'm thinking I have a particular answer that's specific to Philadelphia for the least favorite, but who are your favorites and least favorite?
Well, I think most libertarians gravitate toward Alexander Hamilton as their least favorite. He wanted a more powerful federal government. He wanted a national bank.
And we would kill for that now, right? That would be such a
yes,
massive
we would kill to have
reduction.
Alexander Hamilton now. He did, after all, say you don't need a Bill of Rights because the federal government hasn't been granted any power to interfere with rights. And that's a good point. If you read the Constitution, why would you need a Bill of Rights? Didn't give him any suggestions. Many of the founders have the problem that they were slave owners. And so it becomes very difficult to say, well, my favorite founding father is Thomas Jefferson. He wrote this wonderful treatise, essay, The Declaration of Independence, because there is this nagging problem that he was holding people in slavery. George Mason, in a way, was more libertarian than Jefferson on the role of the federal government, the power of the federal government, but he too was a slaveholder. Now, he did want the Constitution to eliminate the slave trade, but he was still a slaveholder, so that was a problem. And George Washington, though not generally thought of as the most libertarian of the founding fathers, taught the country what it means to be a republic, which is that you don't depend on one man, you don't have a king. He turned down. First, he gave back power at the end of the war. Every other military commander in history, Caesar, Cromwell, Lenin, kept the power. He gave it back. And then he retired from the presidency. And he said, it's not a republic if it depends on one man. So in that sense, I think I will end up by saying it's George Washington who established the principle that we do not live in a monarchy, we live in a republic, and no one man has that kind of power.
Well, thank you so much. The man is David Boaz, and the book is The Libertarian Mind. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Constitution Center.
Thank you, David and Nick, for a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for joining us. David will be signing books, and we have some light refreshments outside. Thank you again. Hope to see you at the Constitution Center.